All right.
Alrighty, now it is my pleasure to introduce our featured reader, Callum Angus. Callum is the author of A Natural History of Transition, which was a 2022 finalist for the Oregon Book Award in fiction, a Lambda Literary Award in transgender fiction, and the Edmund White Award in debut fiction. His work has appeared or is forthcoming in Orion, LA Review of Books, Literary Hub, Portland Monthly Magazine, Catapult, The Common, and many other venues. And he was a 2018 writer in residence at the H.G. Andrews Experimental Forest. That sounds really cool. You need to touch on that. Okay. He edits the journal Smoke and Mold, which publishes nature writing, broadly defined by trans and two-spirit writers. His work moves between the eco and trans literary worlds in order to demonstrate that transition in all its registers is a crucial viewpoint from which to consider the natural world in a time of great upheaval. That sounds so cool. Hi, Cal.
Thank you. That makes me feel very special. Although I think maybe I was like, did I write this or not? I can't remember. I think I did. But thank you. And this is a great group to be here with and share from the story I'm going to read from. And you had brought what did you say? Oh, the Experimental Forest residency. Yeah, everyone should check that out. It's a really under the radar artist residency, not just for writers, all kinds of artists, photographers, poets too, everything. And it's, sorry, car alarm outside, it's a little distracting, but it is about an hour and a half east of Eugene in the Willamette National Forest. And you get 2 weeks in this apartment where you're just in the old growth forest at this research station. You can do whatever you want. You can sit and write. It's like a really swanky apartment too. And it's just like, because I'm not really one of those people who wants to go like camp for like a month and write. Like that doesn't sound like fun to me. Even I love being outdoors though. And I think a lot of people can relate. So definitely check it out. It's the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest. They're really cool folks. So thanks for picking that one out, Jessica. And yeah, this is a wonderful group to read this story. I'm going to read from a short story that's not published yet, but it will be published later this year in Joyland. And it's called Trapunto, which is actually it's a quilting technique. Technically, it's Italian for a quilting technique in which you slice into fabric and stuff more batting into it to give it like a little bit more of a 3D quality. The section I'm going to read, it's a longer story. The section I'm going to read is not explicitly about that. And really, quilting is, we probably won't make it to the end either. So we just have to read it when it comes out later this year. But also, incidentally, I have this quilt on the floor, which I just finished basting like an hour ago. I was showing Jessica earlier and I was like, oh, I got to clean this all up before this reading. And I was like, well, no, it kind of makes sense actually to just leave it there. And I have to do all my quilting on the floor because I don't have any space big enough to do it otherwise. So yeah, okay. And then I'm dropping into this about like almost halfway through. So I've read the first part before and I really want to read this like full scene at the very least. And so all you need to know is that the story is narrated by a trans man, as many of my stories are. His name is Ryan, and the main kind of plot point is that new neighbors have just moved in next door, one of whom is a 13-year-old girl that has his birth name. And this will be an interesting read for you, Ari, especially. And so that's kind of the gist of it. I don't think you need to know anything else. The narrator, he has a husband partner named Finn who comes in a little bit, but he's not a really big presence. And yeah, I think that's it. Okay, so here we go. One more sipple. Sometimes I go to the one place where my breasts still exist. I scroll through pages of before pictures on the plastic surgeon's website, trying to guess which ones were mine. Shot after shot of headless, breasted torsos, a sea of mostly pale white tits, sad tits, some stretched and spent balloons from years of binding, some still full and waiting for the slough, the double calving off the glacier of the chest. Then I see it, the birthmark 2 inches above my right armpit, the size and texture of a pencil eraser. What surprises me is how different they look from how I remember them. The left one sags a whole inch lower than the right, and in the profile shot, there's a thumb-sized bruise on my side boob. What was it from? When had I been so careless? There was a knock on the door. It was 8:30, right on the edge of when it wouldn't be right to knock on someone's door unless it was an emergency, which is an excuse for why the knocking startled me, but really I'm always startled by knocking. Nervous to be caught looking at my topless former self, I sat up quickly and closed the laptop screen where my breasts lived and knocked my empty wine glass to pieces on the floor. The knock came again, more urgent, and while I tried to scoop up the shards of glass, 1 inch-long dagger lodged itself in the meat of my thumb. I winced and waited for blood and pain where none was coming. I tried moving my thumb with the glass still inside, and that did nothing either, except for a strange tugging sensation. When I pulled the shard out, the hole that was left was a small tunnel through my palm, almost to the other side, and looking closely, I could see the flesh was no longer that, but fabric, fraying ends of thread coming off where my whole cloth had been punctured. I hadn't stabbed myself. I'd ripped. I pulled down my sleeve to cover my hand and opened the door to Emma standing there, hands gripping the straps of her backpack, chewing on her bottom lip. "Hello," she said. "Can I come in for a minute?" I shrugged and tried to look nonchalant as I stepped back and gestured for her to enter. "I know you're trans." I stared at her, staring at me, careful not to change my expression. "I read your staff pics online. Novels about transgender shapeshifters and alien space fighters. The Well of Loneliness, Stone Butch Blues, when clearly you're not a lesbian. Plus, you're super short. I figured it out." I'd stopped growing not much past her height. It's not remarkably short for a man, though I am often the shortest man in the room. "Yes," I said, "it's not a secret. I'm very open about it. What do you want to know?" "Everything." She dropped her backpack to the floor and settled into one of the stools at our breakfast bar with a look of hunger in her eyes. But she didn't need to say it. I could see she wanted to know how to go about it, changing into a man. It was the same hunger everyone had. If it somehow came up in conversation with a stranger on the street, they would also start asking about everything. I suddenly felt hardened to her, resentful. At Emma's age, or rather, when I was still an Emma, I barely knew the word transgender. If someone had airdropped a trans man into the vacant house across the street from my childhood home in our tiny college town, it wouldn't have flipped my radar. I didn't have a radar because there was nothing to detect then. My time as Emma was spent suspended in a viscous state of not knowing and wondering why I felt so out of place. The very name had come to represent for me a state of ignorance more than the person I was before. "No one ever asks about the after," I said, switching on the electric kettle. "Everyone always wants to know about the beginning. How did you know? When did you start taking hormones? What did your family do? Did you get the surgery?" "I know not to ask that," she says, proud of herself. I nod. "You can find all of that stuff online anyways. What do you need to talk to me for?" She plays with a chopstick left on the counter, using it as a drumstick on the edge of the formica. She has a lot of energy, too much, I think, more than I remember having at her age. But then again, it was so long ago that perhaps I just forgot what it felt like to be full of her. "I've asked my mom for blockers. Cunt said no." I hadn't heard that word used since I was about her age, but I remember discovering its power, made cleaner and sharper by the fact that I could use it the right way since I had one. But then two things happened. The appetite for cunt as epithet cooled, and I no longer looked like its owner, so it had been decades since I'd heard it spoken with the sincerity that Emma used it now. In the future, you still won't know yourself, I said. She nodded again, but I could tell she didn't understand. It's like this, I said, pulling on a thread. You start this whole process in order to get closer to some idea you have of yourself, some person you can see on a screen, but it's only much later that you realize that that person doesn't actually exist. You made them up. You say it like it's a bad thing, she says. I want to make myself up. Yes, it can be the most wonderful thing. I left that out. Finn entered the kitchen. I was surprised to see him away from his sewing machine. To his credit, he didn't seem fazed to find a 14-year-old sitting at our breakfast bar, but then Finn had had a difficult childhood. He knew something about what it meant when teenagers appeared in unusual places during the night. He nodded at her, picked an orange from the fruit bowl, and introduced himself as he started peeling, filling the room with a burst of citrus. Hello, I'm Finn. Silas, she said. It's nice to meet you, Silas. I'd been steeling myself to hear my dead name from Finn's lips. I'd never heard it from Finn. He knew, I think, somewhere in the murk of his memory, that the name related to me somehow, although the exact nature of that relationship had been lost to him, the way that details about our partners start to blend together after a while into a before and after. When the name didn't come, it brought with it an even more intense ripple of recognition. It's getting late. I think you'd better go home, I said. I was expecting her to put up a fight, but she just nodded and excused herself, said it was nice to meet us, and then left our home. I wished then that I had asked her instead to stay longer, talk with us into the night, share a joint maybe, even though I knew it wasn't appropriate. She's the one who lives across the street, I said, as if explaining to Finn why Silas/Emma had ended up in our kitchen. Finn just hummed noncommittally and busied himself coiling his orange peel into a hollow shell, the juicy flesh consumed, its white pith meeting neatly to conceal his former hunger. I could have told him what her name had been before. I could have described the eerie feeling of having her at the breakfast bar. I could have shown him the hole in my hand from where the glass had entered me, the pale hole it left behind. But I was so happy to see him out of bed and moving around in the dusky kitchen where we'd still not bothered to turn on the lights that I didn't say any of that. I didn't want to ruin the moment with my tendency to overanalyze and worry every little detail of the day into a bigger problem. And so I just wrapped my arms around him and melted into his warmth, set to the humming of the fridge. Be careful, he said, and I immediately took offense, feeling miffed that he'd disturbed our moment with such a sentiment. I don't know what you mean, I lied. Silas, it seems like he's got a lot on his mind. I doubt his parents know. Just don't get too involved. It could get messy. I sighed. I knew about messy. There were things in Finn's past we never spoke about, adults he'd thought he could trust with his most important childhood secrets, only to be betrayed by them in a manner more vicious than the word could contain. It had made him gentle, sweet and caring, miserly with trust and evasive. He kissed me and returned to his quilts under the spotlight of his extendable desk lamp, the patchwork fabric spilling from his machine to his lap and into shadowy darkness. It had been years since he first told me the rough outline of this trauma, a brief explanation as a directive to proceed cautiously, and we'd never spoken of it since. I wondered if I would ever get to hear his story and what about it kept him at the sewing machine, stabbing the same piece of fabric thousands of times over and over, or if it was more important for him to hang on to it where no one could see, a reminder of what he didn't want to be. Let one person try to change in the face of life's hot winds and not be scorched by regret. I could stop there, or I could keep going. I don't know.
Keep going.
Okay. We might make it to the end then. We'll see. Sorry, allergies. I keep a box of old photographs under the bed. It feels odd keeping them there. I don't want to hang them on the wall, but I can't throw them away either. most having been taken in a time before Facebook, and so they exist nowhere else. I inherited all of my parents' albums, but they stay in a box in the garage. The few I let in the house were allowed because they represent versions of myself I had chosen to memorialize, as opposed to the girl or woman in their Polaroids who had never been familiar. Or else it was because I'd just grown used to their company over the years in the little cardboard box under my bed as we moved from place to place like a collection of cells, each a tiny polyp in the reef of identity I was building to anchor myself and hold fast to. Although there was no blood from the cut on my hand, I still put a band-aid over it to make myself feel better. I couldn't sleep, so I decamped from bed and sat reading in the den. Hours later, I saw a light on in a second floor of Emma's house. It glowed pink from the curtains. I glanced at the clock, after 2 on a school night, and wondered what was keeping her up. If her parents knew about or endorsed such insomnia as a creative engine, maybe. In all their planning for their child's future, did they ever stop and wonder that maybe she'd end up a 40-year-old gay man? I very much doubted it. The light switched off. Maybe she was sleeping, or maybe she was using the cover of darkness to observe my own lit window, so rarely illuminated, as I'd learned long ago that in order to sleep, I needed to read for at least an hour beforehand, and if I started that project too late, my eyes would burn before I could finish, and then I'd lay in the dark, eyes smarting, thoughts spinning, wishing sleep for hours. Tonight, though, something pulled me out of the house. It was the feeling that she'd asked me to do something for her, bring her something important, and I'd forgotten about it until that moment. I knocked very, very softly. She came to the door almost immediately, as if she'd been expecting me, and placed one finger on her mouth to silence me. I followed her into the kitchen. Barney, which is her dog, watched me quizzically, his head cocked and paw waiting on top of his favorite toy, but he soon returned to licking the peanut butter out from its hard-to-reach crannies. Emma removed a large yellow block of cheddar from the fridge and cut several slices using a large and gleaming chef's knife in which I saw myself reflected, confused. I didn't want to be rude, but I wasn't hungry. In fact, I felt more full than I ever remembered being, bursting at the seams, though it had been hours since I'd eaten. I watched her cook. She had a little divot on the tip of her nose where the soft bow of cartilage buckles under the skin, and when she smiled, her right front tooth slightly overlapped the left in a way that's gotten worse since she stopped wearing her retainer after braces in the 9th grade. Her left eyebrow has a scar on the end from when she fell headfirst in a bucket as a baby. The general look in her eyes is of someone waiting for something, but they aren't quite sure what. And where to the left of my mouth there's a small but deep scar from a late blooming zit I picked in my 30s. Her cheek is smooth and unpocked. You look so familiar, I say. She nods and scrapes at the pan to dislodge the buttered bread and cheese. Frizzy short hair that I had from the time I was 11 all the way through high school, when it wasn't exactly odd for a girl to have short hair, but still I was the only one who kept it past the tomboy phase, held onto it like a shield. Her strong ankles flare to calves round from running, the same pouch of stomach hanging over her pajama bottoms as I have now, though mine has grown and hardened. After carefully sliding 2 sandwiches on one plate, she returned the skillet to the cherry red burner, glowing up the kitchen, and reaches for my hand. I jerked back before she could touch it, but a thread got caught on a drawer pull and I unraveled slightly. She smiled and set to carefully untangling my loose end from the drawer, and then she began to pull, hand over hand. I watched my hand loosen its bundle of fabric and thread that had been carefully packed together like an exquisitely crafted puppet coming undone, being taken down to fiber and thread and glue, and then nothing, just air, as the unraveled parts of me hung loose to the floor. I wanted to pull away, but the more I struggled, I realized, the faster I came apart. She's realized this too, as she's taking her time, scanning my soft body around her hands like a shepherdess at her spinning wheel, no longer looking vindictive but pensive, almost meditative in how carefully she makes sure my elbows don't tangle with my collarbone and scapula. I want to say something before she gets to my mouth. Ask her ask her about what this is like for her to unwind the patchwork of her future self and see all the missteps and wrong moves come undone to raw thread, ready to be respooled and woven again. At least I hope she will decide to weave me, or maybe she will leave me in a small paper bag on the doorstep for Finn, a little note saying that she thought this might help with his sewing. When I'm just a pile of loosely coiled threads sitting on the counter, I watch Emma finish her grilled cheese. As she chews, small crumbs of buttered toast cling to the corners of her mouth, and I wish she'd used the length of me like a dish towel to wipe them away. That's it.